How inspiring would the Saints hiring Kellen Moore at head coach be? What a question here from the Applebee's Bar and Grill Fantasy Football Happy Hour with Matthew Berry from Radio Row down here in New Orleans. All right, let's go ahead and react to this. So Kellen Moore, because I guess he has a baby face or because he looks unassuming, for some reason has this, like, people are concerned about his ability to lead, his ability to be a leader, his ability to inspire. I'll tell you this, it ain't easy to be a very successful college quarterback to the tune of 50 wins and 3 losses. In order to be that guy, you got to be able to lead a locker room. You got to be able to have players inspired by you as the captain, as the leader of the team, of the program. So that alone should give you a ton of evidence that Kellen Moore can be a focal figure, an inspiring figure, a motivating figure in a locker room.
It's been a lot of news since we've last been on.
Yeah, no question.
Let's jump into the Roto-World headlines here.
Chain.
Of course, for all your Roto-World news, go to NBCSports.com. And in the spirit of being in New Orleans, our first bit of news, NFL Network's Tom Pelissero reports that the Saints plan to meet with the Eagles offensive coordinator Kellen Moore for their head coaching vacancy after the Super Bowl. Almost feels like, guys, and this is the last spot open right now, that they're just waiting for the Super Bowl, and then he will be the next head coach of the Saints.
Yeah, that's how it sounds to me. I think that is appropriate to say.
Saints.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when you're in the Saints, it's the only job open, so you might as well take your time. There's no reason to rush at this point. You're not competing with anyone else.
Yeah.
Kellen Moore, it's an interesting one. Very successful with Dallas. Kind of didn't have a great year with the Chargers. Now seems to be somewhat resurrected with Philadelphia, and how much of that is the credit to his play calling versus, like, they have an unbelievable offensive line. They have one of, if not the best, running back in.
Kellen Moore, something else that's kind of interesting is that the same reasons that people love Ben Johnson or whoever, Joe Brady, are kind of the reasons that people don't like Kellen Moore. Like, I've heard a lot of, like, well, I mean, he's got, look at the roster. It's like, well, those same people are saying Ben Johnson is the second coming of Bill Walsh, right? And then Ben Johnson's roster is equally as good as the Eagles roster, right? Joe Brady, this, and this. Joe Brady has Josh Allen, right? Like, he has the Buffalo Bills. So a lot of the negatives seem to only be negatives in this specific situation with Kellen Moore, who has done what he's doing now over a larger period of time than Ben Johnson or Joe Brady. So Kellen Moore, you would think, would have more evidence of, like, well, yeah, I mean, he has a good roster, but he's also done this in Dallas, whether Ezekiel Elliott has 1,300 yards or whether he has 800 yards. Right? He's been able to get the most out of Dallas's offense. Very different quarterbacks. Dak Prescott, Justin Herbert, and now, Jalen Hurts. So I don't know. I mean, I don't see that as a negative. I think it definitely is a question, just like we questioned it with Ben Johnson and Joe Brady, where it's like, is it him? Is it the offense? Is it the play caller? Or is it, is it the roster?
Football, they have, they've got elite playmakers at almost every position. So I don't know. Like,
is there anything, Connor, to suggest that Kellen Moore is like an outlier, good offensive mind? Like, it seems like the Eagles run 3 different run plays and the passing game's going backwards.
Right. It's listen, I think the Saints, number one, didn't have a lot of hiring power here when you just go through the cap situation. Sure. This is going to take a while to clean up and clean out. And, they went into this process hoping to get Aaron Glenn. That didn't happen. I think there was some other names, maybe Mike McCarthy at once upon a time. And they're going to have to. I
mean, that's not true. Like, that right there is unequivocally not true. Is that, well, the Saints kind of lost out on Mike McCarthy, so they had to do this. When we've said a million times that Mike McCarthy was never interviewed, never offered the job, was never even, really outside of Mike McCarthy's own blog, Mike McCarthy was never tied to the Saints. So Aaron Glenn, I can hear you there, right? But I don't think I don't think if you could go back and re-rank every single candidate, I think Kellen Moore would be 1 or 2 on the Saints list.
You mentioned it. We have different tiers of guests. There's different tiers of head coaching candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I think they expressed interest in Cliff Kingsbury. Cliff did not want to go there. He's come back to the Commanders.
But that conversation, that framing of that is probably incorrect. The idea of Cliff didn't want to go there. It's like, did Cliff not want to go there, or did Cliff not want to be a head coach? Did Cliff not want to enter this head coaching cycle? I mean, Cliff is getting paid. I keep saying Clint because it's Clint Kubiak. Cliff is being paid $8 to $10 million a year by the Cardinals. So he's got Jaden Daniels. He's got a good thing going. He's probably thinking, well, I'll just ride this out here, keep getting that Arizona money, and then if I parlay this into 1, 2, 3 pretty good seasons with Washington, I might be able to be a $20 million a year head coach. So was it more of that or more of anti-Saints?
Handers, hail victory. I think Kellen Moore is probably a pretty good offensive coordinator. Maybe that makes him a good head coach. Maybe that doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't feel like and so much of this, and it's a weird one, right? Because this isn't fair to Kellen Moore. But I feel like so much of coaching hires is about hype, like just hype that gets up in the press and everything like that.
And Ben Johnson.
Exactly. And just I remember, this goes way, way back, but I remember when I was a little kid, and the Washington pro football team had a coaching opening, and I really wanted why am I blanking on the name? He was not Bud Adams. It was who's Buddy Ryan's dad?
Buddy Ryan's dad.
Yeah.
Was it Insult the Comic Dog?
No. It was
Nolan Ryan?
This is a horrific train wreck that I'm watching right now.
I'm completely blanking on it. He was the head coach of the Houston Oilers.
I can't help you.
Are you thinking of Wade Phillips' dad?
I'm Bum Phillips. That's who it was. Thank you. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
We got there.
Thank you. Sorry, it's been a long.
Shout out to Matt not giving up on the bit. I would just gave it up. I would say, you know what? I'm blanking. It'll come back to me. Let's talk about something else. Literally anything else.
Long travel day to get to New Orleans.
It wasn't. It was a relatively short flight.
And I couldn't see the menu. I couldn't see the menu last night, and Jay was drinking dessert wine with his pinky. A lot's going on.
So tough.
Bum Phillips. Bum Phillips was the coach of the Houston Oilers, and Love Ya Blue, and he was a very colorful character.
Oh yeah,
really
big
fun.
jackets and
big
hats.
jackets and the hats, and the media loved Bum Phillips. Always good for a quote. And I was a young fan in Washington, and Bum Phillips was talked about as one of the guys that was potentially open for. And I was so disappointed when they decided not to hire Bum Phillips, who was the guy that had all the hype, and instead they hired some, relatively unknown offensive coordinator from the Chargers named Joe Gibbs.
Worked out.
Obviously, the rest is history. Like,
right.
I just, you know what I mean? And so I just sort of.
Well, you do have to balance that out. Like that, no doubt. Like you have to balance out the hype, and you have to balance out all that with who actually is better suited for the job and who actually can do the job. And sometimes the understated are the best at the actual job. I fully believe that Kellen Moore can do this job. And I think, the idea that he's not as hyped or heralded or whatever, like I could really care less about. Sean Payton wasn't as hyped or heralded whenever he came to New Orleans. And you see a lot like, the Sean McVays and the Kyle Shanahans and a lot of that hype and a lot of that whatever, Kevin O'Connell. Like, it's like a lot of the hype and stuff comes afterwards. And I'm totally fine with that. I would rather that. I would rather get the guy who can do the job, comes in, does the job well, and all of a sudden he's considered one of the best young coaches or whatever in the NFL. So I could care less about the hype side of things and all of that. Get the right guy in the building.
To think about, like, we see some of these insiders and they pump these guys up and, there's all this heat and everything like that. And you're just like, does that necessarily make sense?
Bud Adams.
But I know Bud Adams coaching anyway, I know how my mind got there, but yes, Bum Phillips.
These percentages aren't perfect, but I think for the most part, and this is across multiple different sports, is that 80% of the coaches, there's this kind of sameness. 10% are quite bad, and then there are 10% who are real game changers, revolutionaries. And it just feels like Kellen Moore is taking a shot at the 80% sameness. Like, I don't think that there is a high chance that Kellen Moore is going to be a revolutionary coach who changes the New Orleans. So maybe he can be.
See, I think there's tiers of this. You have like revolutionary coaches who change the NFL, change how offenses are run or defenses are run, or change the game. You could argue Sean McVay was like that. You could argue Andy Reid's like that. You could argue, whatever. But then you have some coaches who are like that with a team, who revolutionize a team, who change a team's trajectory, who changes a team's outlook. Sean Payton was like that with the Saints. I would argue DeMeco Ryans is kind of like that with the Texans. I would argue Kellen Moore has a good chance of being that. A good chance of coming in here, totally changing the franchise and totally pushing that next era in New Orleans and revitalizing the franchise, steadying the boat, kind of giving the next direction for the franchise. That's what I think Kellen Moore can do. Do I expect or consider that Kellen Moore could come in and be a generational coach that could change the NFL? No, you wouldn't expect that from any coach. Can he affect the team? Can he change the team? Can he change where the New Orleans Saints are going? That's what I'm hoping for. And I think he can do that. I don't expect him to come in here. If we would have hired Ben Johnson, I would say the same thing. I don't expect Ben Johnson to come in and generationally change how offenses run. But you're also not asking him to do that. You're asking him, hey, make us better. Hey, get the most out of our players. Hey, win the division. Hey, win double-digit games. Hey, get to the playoffs. If all that other stuff happens, fine. But you don't start with that when you're bringing in a new coach.
Maybe he hasn't gotten a chance to be a head coach before. Maybe that will unlock something, but I don't think we've really seen that level of revolution.
If he gets the time. Yeah. I think that's the hard part. There's just a lot of, roster turnover that's needed here. The cap situation is very real. Finally, they can't just wiggle their way out of this one.
Yeah, and it's a team that's more or less devoid of talent. I mean, to your point about the 80%, you know what I mean? Like, give me a good quarterback, and you're probably going to be a pretty good coach. If you don't have the players, you don't. Like,
who's the 80%? Is Kevin Stefanski one of the 80%? Is Kevin O'Connell one of the 80%? Like, if that's what you're getting, I'm cool. Sweet. Like, who are the generational coaches that he would consider in the NFL? Like, is it the Sean McVays and the Kyle Shanahans and Andy Reid and that's it? Because there's a lot of coaches. I just said DeMeco Ryans. I know he's defensive and Kellen is offensive, but I think that is way too binary to just be like, you're either in the 80% of normal or you're in the 20% of revolutionary. I think that's that's a horrible way of looking at it. You have, if I had to do percentages, you probably have closer to 20% or 30% good coaches. 30% good coaches, probably 60% bad coaches or average to bad, and then 10% really, really good coaches, literally game changing. That's how I would kind of divvy it out. We just want to hit a good coach. We want to hit an above average to good coach to be in those conversations with KOC and Kevin Stefanski and DeMeco Ryans and some of those guys. Like, that's what you're looking for. I would put Sean Payton in that area for Denver right now. Like, I would say he's an above average to good coach. He's in that percentile. Jim Harbaugh is probably at the top end of that percentile. Like, John Harbaugh is a good example. John Harbaugh, is he a generational revolution? Did he change how the NFL, how coaching is done? Did he change anything in the NFL? No. He's just a damn good coach. He's a damn good coach who runs his team very well and gives an infrastructure to the team. But, so I think that's asking a bit much of these coaches. If Kellen Moore ends up being the trajectory of John Harbaugh, cool. Works for me.
I think Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury did an unbelievable job this year. But, it also helps that Jaden Daniels is like a generational talent.
Yeah.
That's a different team with a,
both those guys were head coaches before, and it didn't necessarily look like that.
Yeah, but even Washington's a good example. Is Dan Quinn or Cliff Kingsbury generational? What percentage are they falling into? You can certainly be good, successful, have great seasons, have a great tenure, play for playoffs. You can even win Super Bowls without being in that small percentage that they're mentioning.
Right, exactly. I mean, so it's, it's really interesting. This will be interesting to see what Kellen Moore does. There are some people that are good coordinators that become great head coaches and vice versa. I don't think everyone is excited about Dan Campbell as a hire. He wasn't like a hot head
laughed
coach.
at.
And then he got dominated. Remember, Sirianni, same thing. Sirianni opening presser, people were laughing at him. Dan Campbell opening presser, people were laughing at him. And then Dan Campbell immediately starts losing and then turns around and now everybody loves him. So we're a little too quick to judge and call a coach successful or non-successful or anything like that.
The kneecaps comment.
Right.
But at least Dan Campbell was like an outlier in terms of his profile coming in, where he was like high variance, where we didn't know what we were going to get out of Dan Campbell, and it feels like we've ridden the variance to a good degree with him. Doesn't seem like Kellen Moore has a great deal of variance, particularly with this roster, with all their questions basically everywhere. Like the defense really fell off as well. Like Derek Carr, had 2 good games to start. It's not a great situation anymore.
Yeah, roster-wise, no doubt. Like the roster is bad. It is turning over. We're rebuilding, but that has nothing to do with Kellen Moore's ability to be a coach.
Just think about this. Like I think about Brian Callahan. Like, jury's still out on Brian Callahan,
right, yeah.
And obviously comes from good stock, right? His father, a legendary coach. But, it's one thing when you coach when you've got Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, and it's another thing when you're going there and you're trying to figure it out with, a bad offensive line and not a lot of weapons. So there you go. And people, that's near us. They're applauding my take on Brian Callahan. This is awesome. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You have an audience.
Yeah, much happier with that take than he was your flashlight last night.
Apparently, yeah. Anyway, so we will see on Kellen Moore. I would suspect that it would be just given where, think about what they do in Philadelphia, think about what they did in Dallas for so many years, that this will be an offense that'll be once again revolved around Alvin Kamara and Chris Olave, right? Hopefully they get Rashid Shaheed back. They got to figure out quarterback. They don't know what they're doing here.
Yeah, you got to figure out what you're going to do at quarterback. You got to figure out what you want to do at 9 at the 9th overall pick in the draft, like where you go there.
But it's worth noting that he's had 6 years as an offense coordinator, Kellen Moore, and his offenses have been top 8 in scoring in 4 of those 6 years.
That you probably should have led with that, my boy. Like, that's pretty strong.
So he's when he's been given talent, he's been able to produce. It's just this is a team devoid of talent.
Yeah.
Now, that part is a good question where it's like, okay, we know what it looks like at the top end. Like, we know, okay, you give him a good roster, you give him talent, he can get the most out of it. He can get you a good offense. What does it look like building that talent? What does it look like getting the roster up to snuff? What does that process look like, the draft and free agency and evaluating players? Like, that part is a huge part of being a head coach.
And to be fair to Kellen Moore, who we haven't really said that many good things about, like the Eagles, I don't think their offense is particularly complex, but perhaps that is the smartest thing to do with this offense, with their personnel, and he's done that, and they've been more successful than they were last year.
And listen, Brian Johnson was not successful with this offense last year. Now, he didn't have Saquon last year, but still, they had.
Yeah, still, that is part of it too, where this roster that we're talking about, incredible roster, whatever, last year, at the end of the year, the Eagles were horrible, right? So, I think being able to get the most out of what you have is a talent, for sure. Like, you can't knock somebody. It'd be like it's like knocking a college football team who goes undefeated, and you're like, well, they didn't play anybody. It's like, well, they went undefeated. They played who was in front of them. They played their schedule, and they won every game.
DeAndre Swift, they had real running backs,
top receivers.
It was more or less the same personnel with the exception of, an upgrade at running back. Big upgrade, but still, I don't know. Like, you're right. Like, Kellen Moore could be fine. It just doesn't feel like a super inspiring hire here for the Saints.
It's more in the Brian Schottenheimer bucket.
I think that's insane. Brian Schottenheimer, this is crazy. This is pissing me off. Brian Schottenheimer hasn't done nothing. Ever. In his entire career, he's never had a position of substance at all. Hasn't called plays in Dallas. He's the head coach. That is uninspiring. Kellen Moore, 6 years as an OC, 4 of 6 highly successful, OC in the Super Bowl, potentially winning the Super Bowl and going to be your head coach, 36 years old. Very inspiring. Again, these guys just seemingly don't like or don't care for how understated Kellen Moore is, like personality-wise. But if you look at this resume, it should be very inspiring. It should be way more inspiring than Liam Cohen. It should be way more inspiring than Joe Brady would be. And I have a sneaky feeling because of the hype and because of the whatever, they would be singing a different song if it was Joe Brady, which I think is crazy. Kellen Moore's resume and what he's done has to speak for itself. But to put him in the same bucket as Brian Schottenheimer is laughable, completely laughable.
Than, some of the other hires we've seen, like Ben Johnson.
Last thing I'll say,
again, what is the difference? You tell me. What is the difference between Ben Johnson and Kellen Moore? Just on the surface. I mean, just like resume, just bullet point. What is the difference? Because Ben Johnson is he's not a rah-rah Dan Campbell guy. So they almost are kind of the same physically, how they sound, how they talk, their makeup, kind of the same. Ben Johnson does a few more like wrinkles, and like you see more, double passes and reverse passes and the fumble thing they did with Jared Goff or whatever. But how far does that actually go? I don't know. But I really don't see the difference in Ben Johnson and Kellen Moore. Just from the surface, just looking at it like from the outside in, just headline, just like these two guys are hired. Who's more exciting? I don't see, besides the media hype and besides how good of a story Detroit was this year, I don't see why Ben Johnson should be categorized as like so much more exciting than Kellen Moore.
Here, though, Dan Quinn, not an inspiring hire. The fan base wanted Ben Johnson last year. And when Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury were hired, it felt like, at least to some people, that this was like a second choice or, not the, because last year it was Ben Johnson, it was Mike McDonald were the hot head coaching candidates. And Dan Quinn, it was sort of like come off the bad loss for Dallas had the bad loss in the playoffs where the Packers just blew them out at home. And so people were like, and obviously that worked out fantastically. So jury is still out. We will see who the Saints wind up with, but it's looking like it's going to be Kellen Moore, and it'll be an offense that'll be centered around the obvious guys.
Hey, it's Matt.
All right, there you go. So what do you think? How exciting is the Kellen Moore hire if it happens? Ladies and gentlemen, let me know in the comments below. Covered a lot in this video. I'll see you in the next one.